for making it. Maya has asked me to convey her regrets, because she's the person who was meant to be introducing you, and she would have made a much better job than I will. But we have a small and excellent audience, and we have the masses in screens worldwide. So Julia Kolchinsky Dasbach emigrated from the city of Dnipropetrovsk, which as I learned is called now Dnipro, in Ukraine, when she was 6, as a Jewish refugee. Since then, she has become a recognized American poet and the author of numerous poetry books. Among them, the many names for Mother, which you can see on the table, which won the Week Poetry Prize, as well as the Don't Touch the Bones, which won the 2019 Idaho Poetry Prize, and which will be published next year. And also 40 Weeks, a forthcoming volume from Yes Books, which was written while pregnant with Julia's now 3-month-old daughter. Her poems could also be found in numerous literary journals such as Poetry, American Poetry Review, and The Nation. Julia holds an MFA from the University of Oregon and is currently finishing her PhD in comparative literature at the University of Pennsylvania. The title of her dissertation is Lyric Witness: Intergenerational Representation of the Holocaust in American Poetry. Julie is also the editor of The Construction magazine. Thank you for coming.
Thank you so much for inviting me, and I feel like I have to start by just thanking my great aunt who's here, because she was the first person I saw when we emigrated. We emigrated, and I'm gonna cry. But we emigrated and we came through New York, and she was the first smiling face I saw. And I remember they had gotten me fruit roll-up, and as a 6-year-old who had never eaten any of this, it was incredible. There was fruit roll-up and there was snacks, and we had just traveled across the ocean. So it's all blurry, but I just remember it being wonderful, and it being a really wonderful welcome. For war and water. Everyone is having boys, my mother says. That means war is coming, the way it came in the old country, boys rising out of the ice and cold potato fields, boys laying bricks and digging wells and trenches and bodies, boys out of other boys, like my boy, born the year before. Cops killed even more black boys, and boys killed other boys for loving boys, and more swastikas showed up on walls, and more walls showed up where once ran rivers. But a river is not a boy. A river can either run dry or bleed, and everyone will blame someone, darker or an animal. The gorilla who stole a little boy, or the gator who dragged away another. But in the water, they seem so strong, resilient even. These boys born months apart. These boys who suck the water down, who beat it with their tiny fists and kick as though they're running. These boys who grow not knowing they were born for war, and that it's everywhere, and there is no outrunning water. So when I first began putting together a collection of poems 6 years ago, my writing looked towards the past, ancestral trauma and my immigration as a child. And I thought that with the birth of my son in 2015, that this would change, that I would all of a sudden start looking to the future, when in fact, motherhood actually entrenched my writing even deeper in history and the intergenerational trauma into which my children are inscribed, albeit unwittingly so. So I'm going to use this poem called Archive, which will be in my next book, Don't Touch the Bones, to kind of walk us through some of the poems from the Many Names for Mother. And Archive opens with what you see up there. I'm going to sit down just so you can take a look. It opens with a modified photo that I took at the Auschwitz-Birkenau Memorial Museum when I was there on a 3-week fellowship, a full week of which was spent in Auschwitz, the city which was then renamed to Auschwitz I, and then the death camp Auschwitz II-Birkenau. To call the Book of Names Shoah exhibit, which is where this comes from, a document or a memorial or an installation, let alone a book, doesn't really do it justice, because it stands as a giant wall hanging that takes up the entire block 27, which the Auschwitz was divided into different blocks where prisoners were kept. And it was as much a challenge to turn its pages as it was to face the seemingly endless catalog of names, each sheet taller and wider than my own then 6-month pregnant body. Still, the ability to turn the pages myself filled me with a sense of hope that my great-grandfather's name would actually be among those listed. But it wasn't, and neither were any of my other ancestors who died during the Holocaust in Ukraine. Upon returning from Poland, I wrote the opening poem of this book that would in many ways define all the poems to come, cinching together my ancestral past and my present experience of motherhood. It's called Against Naming. And the one thing to know about this poem is that, if you recall, in 2015, it was the hottest summer on record in Europe until this summer. And so some of you might remember the story of the sprinklers going up at the gates of Auschwitz in order to help tourists bear the heat. And this was really in the news. So that's what I reference in this poem. Against naming. It's very weird to read poetry seated. I don't know if I've done it before. I feel like I have to stand. Against naming. Let's not name her or compare flesh to fruit. Let's joke instead how she swallowed a seed and let it grow inside her. Just imagine how heavy is that sound and what it must taste like in ripe summertime heat. I had no cravings though, only wanted to touch the cold or be touched. Polish berries carried the winter, so I ate them by the bucketful. Currants, cherries, sour. Childhood in my mouth, a past made sweeter by its being past. My mother sweating through Talkuchka, the little push and shove bazaar, only to return home with a stained skirt and fruit dangling from her ears and me hungry inside her. The Krakow market was a harvest too, the hottest July on record, and in Auschwitz the camps didn't know what to do with all the people in such heat. So at the gates of Auschwitz, sprinklers appeared, for the children mostly. And you, my love, were just about the size of a heart inside me then, warm and wanting a past that isn't this, one not passed down. But I carried you there anyways, against my family's urges, against your future ones maybe. Walked you across black ground, turned red, then gray, then left for colorless, the dead around us growing, the dead beneath us silent. And I sang to you of a golden city under a paling sky with its single star and flame-made lion waiting there. They listened. Perhaps you did too. Ashes rising in the creek, and in Birkenau's purple wildflowers, its big book of names from which we did not choose to name you. Valiant, strong, unmarked, by ancestry or first generation or Slavic or fruit. V for the survivor who refused to be named that, for the numbered and unnumbered names unwritten and scattered there, for the woman who made seeds grow as gorgeous out of flesh as out of stone. So in the summer of 1941, my great-grandfather had arranged for his family to go into evacuation in the Ural Mountains back, and he stayed back in Kiev as a Jewish partisan. While Kiev was still under air raids and returning was forbidden, my great-grandmother made her way back to look for him. She found their apartment empty, and only weeks or even months later, time being as plastic as memory during the experience of trauma as it is after, she heard rumors that a neighbor had turned him into an SS officer, and some say that he was dragged away. Everyone assumes that this meant he was killed at Babi Yar, the two-day massacre of more than 33,000 Jews in Kiev. But there is nothing to prove or disprove that this happened. The only certainty is his absence from every archive. And this very absence has become an answer in and of itself for me. The historical mode, preoccupied with naming, cataloging, and counting, is one of the most troubling aspects of the way the Holocaust is represented throughout historic sites and institutions, and how it is recounted in many narrative-driven films and memoirs. This mode of documentation, which in my dissertation I argue is itself mimetic of the programmatic violence and record-keeping enforced by the Nazis in the camps in the West, it fails when it comes to the Holocaust in Soviet territories. There, Nazis mobilized national groups to conduct mass killings by shooting squads, with the goal of leaving no trace, no way to account or recount the dead. This leaves subsequent generations with what I have termed lyric witness as virtually the only mode for engaging with this underdocumented history. Mediating between perspectives and temporalities, lyric witness connects intergenerational stories with the poet's current sensibility of self and Holocaust memory. The archive, as Dada notes, while preserving some things to be remembered, leaves out others to be forgotten. So in turning to the archive to provide my family with a tangible history, I only found it missing without a trace, Пропавший без вести, the title given to my great-grandfather post-mortem. This is why I felt compelled to take a photo of this page where his name would have been, to show his daughter, my grandmother, some kind of evidence by way of its very lack. In the poem, the photo stands as proof of the countless unnamed by the archive, which we consider to be a keeper of history and a professor of quote-unquote truth. The photo is proof of the gaps with which such sources are rife. Gaps, I believe, poetry can illuminate, pointing readers to the impossibility of filling them when it comes to trauma. So now I'm going to read a fairly long poem that's a sequence called Learning Yiddish. And it's written for my great-grandmother, Vikla Moishka Gershkovna Kaufman. Vera, though I never called you that, you, Babushka, Grois Babi, Mamen, whose name in Russian rings of faith, in Yiddish of debate, in Latin it is all that's true, though other Romance tongues have argued you to claim impartial judgment like a god. Then in the German, Vera is a strong wild boar, sowing the fields your yellow hue. But when I searched the Hebrew, you floated up out of the letters of your own Talmudic name, Vav, Vav, Yud, Resh, Aleph, two hooks, wisdom, beginning, or a head, then teacher. Vera, let me say your name again. Which tongue do I believe, and which did you? She doesn't remember, but I woke one morning to her pounding, boring holes in the wall with the black tip of her cane. She trapped herself inside the bathroom, the cane hovering like the nose of an unnamed fish about to fall out of the drywall. She was still mumbling, Goten Yutayer, Goten Yuveismir, and my foreign words to calm her. There's no one there, stuck to to the walls. In her flowered robe, she sat on the toilet. Vera doesn't remember, but this is how I found her, wet and swollen, varicose veins, like humpback whales, unable to come up for air. In languages we could not understand, and then again for all of us to hear and comprehend, she screams about his filthy hands and how she'd never let them touch her where she'd already been touched by warmer hands that never lit a match nor pressed it to the body of a living man. Does she remember or imagine him, the beast that kicked flesh with a hunter green boot into a hole full of half-live bodies, men trapped between sleep and death, men waiting to be set on fire with their brothers, one man, most tenders, whose hands still dream to hold her hands and wield her cane and shoot. I'm told she wasn't always like this, told by others like my mamen and hers, told her legs was thinner, hair was darker, and lips were always red. I'm told that even during war, when they dyed her yellow and worked her raw, even after, when my father had to lift her across the Atlantic to a land she'd only heard was warmer and freer and more colorful in the fall, even then, she took the time to put on lipstick, the bright red kind that leaves smudges on men's shirt collars. One night, back in the motherland, her husband did not return, so she walked barefoot through the grasslands, following dry drops of blood encased in hoof prints. She found a moose head, his nose still warm, still melting the surrounding snow. Her body fell to him, inhaling rusty iron mixed with mane. He would come back to her across the decades, still warm, still with his half-live lurking eyes, though all the rest of us were blind. What if that morning smelled not quite how I remember? Did you get out the broken Maybe you got out the broken Soviet samovar to make chamomile tea and let the smoke creep up the stairs under my sheets to wake me. Were lemons cut to perfect circle and placed around a gold-rimmed plate with pryaniki and sour cream and so much sweet and yellow glow that you made the entire kitchen grow together into you until I couldn't tell the scents apart. So now even my husband smells of you or something flesh-like I remember. But memory's a wild and fragile thing. It's glass we shattered under the chuppah. And he's a German, did I tell you that? His last name pounds like hands striking a keyboard. Bach, Bach, Bach. Were you playing his name that morning against the wall, sounding out his syllables with your cane, calling for him to rescue you with his name? Sasha was his name, Iana Volubila, her daughter tells me, over the last of the Kins Marauli. He didn't drink, and his clothes smelled of smoke from the ironing board. I saw her take his hand, the first man's she touched since. More wine, she lets it overflow. Blue eyes, too blue to be like ours, they showed a coast I'd never seen. I dream about them sometimes. I look away. She never married him, you know. Noana Volubila. On my pillow, blonde-haired, blue-eyed, he left the only doll I ever had. And while I held her plastic body, my mother pushed him out the door. They say when her husband was sent to Siberia, she refused to stay in their brick apartment. She traveled first by rail, then by wagon, to a land of no women and no heat, only ice and mercury, where convicts were once patriots and clay huts once were homes. They say she gave birth to her first girl there, on an oven or a bathroom floor, or in their straw-stuffed bed. They say she screamed for water, and neighbors came running, and then she screamed for more, and I believe them. Simcha, the prize, the beloved, the listener, the boundary for one or all of us. His name is not carved into a plaque lit up by an eternal flame, nor did we find it in a list that names all those who burned or fell away from bone. When I read you the list of Babi Yar victims and his nomen was missing, did you remember your return to Kiev, the unburied city where nooses swung suspended from trees and telephone poles, where handmade ropes strangled the breath from necks in uniform, left men dangling for days, while survivors watched December's frost flake away and take the hangman's skin? Men who wouldn't be laid to rest in breadbasket soil alongside the thousands they heaved into it. Vera, you had no place to pray over the loss of unrecorded body. Even from this American coast, I see the dust that looms above that frozen ground, living entombed beneath the dead. If only their breath could melt the deepening snow. Show us where to dig for all the missing, and let your granddaughter stop waiting for her father to come home. These belong to you, Vera, the heads and blood, those moose you said were hanging from the walls, the precious teeth hidden in a glass of murky water, never safe from Nazi thieves. White sleeping pills you thought we secretly snuck into dog food to keep the German Shepherd Guard from waking us when men in green would come for you. Your walker with its worn down tips and rusted legs, and your hands with their fortune creases. They're gone, all gone now. My fast for you on Yom Kippur, 25 hours without food or drink or washing or sex, thinking of you and God. You walking towards him through the kitchen, convinced the lit gas stove was the burning bush whispering, "Take off your shoes." But our house, this land we took you to, uprooted from black earth where your body could have slept in wheat fields, this house, our house, was never your holy ground. So the impulse to name, I think, is a way of coping, of trying to grasp, of understand through language. But at the core of trauma is the incomprehensible. So I turn to origins of words, as I did with the name Vera, to etymology, to help me understand what they have come to mean. Knowing this is a failed endeavor from the start, because when it comes to trauma, language fails also. But poetry can render this failure transparent, the failing of language. So I try to startle the rift between the destruction of language and its creation, to make this rift felt aloud. The affect of the poem becomes one of discomfort and questioning, rather than closure. In The Body in Pain, Elaine Scarry writes, to witness the moment when pain causes a reversion to the pre-language cries and groans is to witness the destruction of language. But conversely, to be present when a person moves up and out of that pre-language is to be present at the birth of language itself. So I'll just show you, I'm not reading this poem for you, but I wanted to show you what happens here with naming. Let's see if I can zoom in. Oh, look at that, I can. So what happens here with naming and trying to name my great-grandfather. Simeon, Simachka, Simeon, Simeon, Senya, Senya, Sima, Sima, Simcha, Simcha, Simon, Sema, Sema, муж, husband, отец, father, papa, ded, dedushka, grandfather, pradedushka, great-grandfather, great-great-grandfather, prapradedushka, великий, great, dead, deceased, gone, shot, dead, murdered, dead, пропавший без вести, missing, dead, without a trace, dead, without news, dead, without birds, dead, ded, dedushka. And the elision between the word for grandfather in Russian and the word dead. Another poem in this book particularly that really deals with etymology that I wanted to share with you is called Camp Means Field. And it is the etymology of the word camp because it comes from the word field. And for me, that connection between those two words really helped bring the fields of slaughter in the Soviet territories with the camps in Poland. Camp means field, means open. Summer means temporary, means go there someday, I tell my son. Naming the sun and wildflower by color. Burnt means blue, doesn't exist in nature, means tasteless, but blue means camp, and war in the body means adhering to doctrine or cause. Camp fever, epidemic fever, light fever, never burnt down. Fever means endless, means as far as the eye can see. But what if the eyes are gone and in their place are flowers, means in their sockets are stones. My son, a stone in my belly then, my ancestors' stones around us, means field of stones is not camp. Even if camp means field, means I have to stop writing stones, carrying stones, throwing, burying stones, weighing the body down with what it's lost. Flowers, I say. Camp means field. I say it again, means this isn't my meaning. My lager, lagging stone, means what can be remembered or named, means laggend behind, means laggend without water is still a field growing, largest to lagrima, to grime, amalgam of languages I don't know what they mean or where they come from. But lagid means field, because field means everything crammed below the earth, means things growing out that were once pushed down. Camp means when I pushed my son out of me, I felt I birthed a stone. Flowers loose in my moleskin, brought back from stone fields, means the fields we were pushed out from, means the fields we were pushed into, means there is no camp to return to, but there is still a field. Polya, margin, square, bent, brim, bound, domain, range, providence, provide, expanse, expanding, flat means flattened earth of stones, means stoned bodies or bodied stones, means when you hear Holocaust, holy, burnt, or burned whole, sacrifice by fire, burnt, offering, caustic, whole, you don't hear stones or fields or flowers, means you don't hear blue, because gone and gray and counted way far more, and you don't hear a name because there are too many, and you don't hear a body because the same, means you hear in plurals, in bodies, you imagine them, means magnitude, you weigh how wrong it is to figure them this way, their lack or lessening means them as stones again or still. But when my son hears holy and challah and cost, years and years from now, hears it over breakfast with his family perhaps, he will hear a field means the ghost who lingers there, means imagine growing wild, chicory, dog violets, snowdrops, baby blues, flowers, as far as the eye can see. So while I'm not denying the need for history or records being critical to our understanding of the scale of catastrophe and proof that it happened, for deniers especially, to some degree, the focus on the narrative of what happened, on the story, distracts us from feeling its effects, and most importantly, from the question of what do we do now? Whenever I'm asked what my dissertation is about, and I say contemporary American poetry about the Holocaust, the most common question is, really? Are people still writing about that? And the answer is yes. We are. We must. We engage the past in order to influence the present. Mourning is not only to remember, but to construct how we understand traumatic memory. This history, no matter how much of its story we think we know, is not something we can ever close the book on or feel resolved about. because that's when we are most at risk, as our current political environment makes us acutely aware. The poetry reminds us that even through deepest exploration of language and form, acute attention to origin, endless research, we are only left with more questions. And so we must reach beyond answers, beyond meaning, and through both content and form, render unknowable absences. Lyric witness is a mode that allows us to deal with such catastrophe in a manner that's implicating, irresolvable, and at its core political. So I'm just going to end with a few more poems. Let's see, what's our time? Yeah, I have time for a few more poems. I'm going to read one more sad one and then two happy ones, because the book is not all depressing, but a lot of it. To talk about the political power and action of poetry, this poem is called Letter to My Son, and my son's birthday happens to be on November 8th. Yours too. So November 8th, 2016, as you'll recall, you probably went and voted. It was such an exciting day for me and my son. He turned 1. And then the next day, I wrote this poem. Letter to my son on his first birthday, November 8th, 2016. Remember, here you are a white man, pearl, bone, tooth, pillowcase, linens, cotton, mouth, mourning, but only here. Across the water you are dark, soiled, branch, riverbed, blackbird, blood, bruise, mouth, mourning. You are otherness, among others, and among yours. Remember, they won't see it here at first. They'll call you by your given name. They'll hold your hand and ask to hear your history. They'll listen as generations slip from your tongue. Soiled bones, and teeth, and linens, and mouths. A shower of galaxies, of stars made brighter by galaxies gone dark. They'll trust you when you say your pockets are empty, but I'll have taught you to carry stones, to save them for the graves, because you never know when you will walk among the dead, because you'll know they're everywhere. But remember, here you are a white man, the dead under your skin, your feet, inside your mouth. They crack your white bones, milk teeth, raw gum line, still sealing soft spot. They whisper, you were never one of us, and hold you to their chest to sink you into ground. But remember, little son, you are more than stone or pearl or star or mineral, more than body or metaphor can make you, or color name you, or land and water divide you, more than ma or man or mine. You will know our stories in your bones, branch, black sea, bruised and blooming. When the neighborhood boys threw stones at your mother, and words at her mother, and then hands at hers, when they threw fists at your grandfather, and bullets at his, and finally shoved your great-great-grandfather so far beneath the earth no stone or throw could reach there, you will know that none of us were white men then. Remember, when half of your ancestors died, the other half did the killing. Remember, murderer and murdered are just one death apart, and your skin too is translucent, kin on its underside, kin just one sibilance away. Remember how much this matters everywhere, how skin hurts, how no love is deep enough to forget this, and no skin strong enough to endure. And to try and end on something a little more uplifting, who here has been told a joke in Russian tried to be translated into English? Has anyone had this horrifying experience of someone who speaks Russian thinking that that joke is so funny and it's going to translate well? It rarely translates well. And because I I don't know how to write funny poems. This was an attempt to write a funny poem. My husband told me, try to write a joke. So this is what I did. It's called Jokes Don't Translate Well from Russian. And it is the true story of how my husband met my mother. It goes something like this. There was once an alcoholic, because it always starts with drinking, and his wife, because every husband must come with one. And she, of course, wants him to quit, and wears robes and makes tea constantly, serving sweets and preserves and sour cream, always sour cream. My mother tells us over wine and tea and sweets and, yes, sour cream, because being from Ukraine, it is even more certain. And the preserves are always cherry. But back to this wife. Her friend advises her to fill a bathtub to the brim with vodka and then throw in a dead cat. He'll be so disgusted, he'll never want to drink again. My mother finishes her white. The red gives her a headache now, or an upset stomach, or some other pain, a sobering one she's discovered in America. Then she tells the unworthy boy I brought home, my husband, years of drinking later, that the secret to keeping a woman happy is to always keep her glass full. And so he does this, and the wife too does as she's told, then leaves the house. How easy it must have been to find dead cats back there and then. When she returns that night, everything is quiet. No stumbling or snoring, no bottles or body on the floor. She goes into the kitchen. My mother holds her breath. Then I jump in to clarify why that bathtubs were often in kitchens and multi-purpose. Ours would be covered with a wooden board and transformed to a makeshift table for cutting potatoes and kielbasa and onion or anything boiled or pickled, soon to be doused in mayonnaise and garlic and, yes, sour cream. But this wife sees the bathtub is empty, and the husband is wringing out the dead cat, whispering, "Nu kiska, nu еще чуть-чуть." This part doesn't sound as good in English, she says. Kitty, a little more. No, a few more drops. And then my mother takes the empty bottle, mimicking the ringing motion. This is how we squeeze everything to the last drop. The dead are no exception. And I'll finish with a poem for my son that has been on my mind a lot lately with the environmental movements that are happening by young people. And there's a way in which I feel like as children we are so much more connected to nature. There's something, that carnal animal quality in us that connects us to it. And then as we grow older, we lose that connection. Almost as though as we grow older, we kind of feel ourselves more connected with history, but less connected with the present natural world around us. So this poem is called Dada Vada. Dada Vada, my son calls any body of water. Man, Mr. Uncle Water, Uncle Sea, Uncle Ocean. Dada, not father, but close, though we didn't teach him this. Kinship, nature flowing into family, vast expanse, into what is already inside him. Обними, Dada Vada, he says, and wraps his arms around the waves. Hug Uncle Water, and he falls flat onto the sand, palms wide and sinking as though into my body. Your kid is beautiful, a passerby says. Have more, a whole litter. And if you have them close together, his cheek is in the sand, mouth full of salt. What's one more, she says. Everything, I think, and want to hold him, but he is water, and no matter how wide I stretch my arms, I cannot hug or count, cannot contain the whole of him. Thank you so much.
Well, now we have the time to ask Julie a few questions. maybe I can actually start
Sure.
with the most obvious one about the relationship between your poetry and your scholarly work. Are you generating material for your dissertation, or is it a more complex story?
So my dissertation is a hybrid scholarly and creative project, which I'm very fortunate to be at Penn with amazing advisors that are letting me do this. And so, for example, the first chapter is on poet Jean Debroux, who has a beautiful book of, a chapbook of poems called The Promised Bride. And it's written from the perspective of Shulamit, of Song of Songs, and of Paul Celan's Death Fugue. And it's all sonnets and villanelles. And so in response to that chapbook, I'm writing other sonnets and villanelles. And the chapter is actually itself structured like a sonnet. So there's a real complex relationship between, I would say, the content and form. And each chapter of my dissertation tries to mimic the form that I'm investigating. So this poem is in my chapter on the archive and on this very bizarre archival collection that I stumbled on in the Holocaust Museum that's translations from Yiddish into Russian of songs and poems about the Holocaust that were done by an emigre when he came here. And there are no originals, no original Yiddish, just a compilation of these Russian poems and songs that he wanted to publish as a book dedicated to his parents who were victims. And the Holocaust Museum kind of disavows this as a legitimate history-bearing item and discouraged me from working with it, in fact. They said, oh, these are all, translations, we don't have originals, and we don't really know where they come from. Most likely, he got the poems from newspapers and things like that, so it's all already published. And that became a wonderful challenge for me because I think it is very legitimate, and the act of translation as a mode of coping and of memorializing. And the fact that this emigre named Roman Kaminsky, who I've tried to find and I haven't been able to, and they wouldn't give me access to finding him too. I kept wanting to try and find his family. But the fact that he committed to doing this and then ended up donating this collection rather than trying to get it published, because he donated it to the institution that would, name his parents, where they're unnamed everywhere else. Kind of like, in a way, what I feel like my poetry is doing. In a way, I feel like that's why I have to keep writing and I keep being obsessed. As my mother said to me once, she's like, you just won't let your great-grandmother stay asleep in the grave. You just, every time, you just keep, she's turning in there. She just keeps, because you just can't stop writing about her.
I'd love to actually, by that same token, I love the idea of a lyric witness, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about like the formal possibilities you see in that. Could it be like a lyric essay hybrid?
Yes.
Do you, what are some of the possibilities of that, especially with technology,
I haven't, honestly, the technology aspect is so interesting because I guess that's kind of what I'm doing with this photo. I haven't explored that as much. I find it quite troubling what's happening in museums and the holograms that they're putting in. You've heard about this, right? That the survivor testimonies are being transformed to holograms in order to make it more relatable to current generations. That, to me, I'm very unsettled by it. So I haven't thought about the technological possibilities, but that's really fascinating. So I think what drew me to lyric witness, there's a lot of scholarship on various degrees of witness, right? Primary, secondary, just a huge scholarly body of work, and of course Marianne Hirsch's Generations Post-Memory. But for me, lyric and witness come together given their inherent opposition, right? Lyric privileging emotion and the moment, and witness privileging fact and narrative. And given their opposition, that's what I think makes it perfect for poetry, because it kind of denies one being privileged over the other, and they are present contemporaneously. And I don't know if I would look at it as a form so much as kind of a genre, right? Because there's no, I think that the beauty of this being a mode through which one can write is that it isn't constrained by generic forms, and that it can be a sonnet, and that it can be a villanelle. And I also, in my dissertation, I argue that lyric witness is not just a mode of writing, but it's actually a mode of scholarship. So by writing this dissertation that is blended, that is cross-genre, that rejects the notion of an objective observer in a way, I'm modeling this mode of lyric witness that I think is necessary for us to keep engaging with past atrocity, with present atrocity, in a way that kind of complicates our idea of a settled story, or our idea of knowing what happened, right? That question. Does that get it?
Oh yeah, that's great. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Just another obvious one. How do you think about that time when your kids will start reading your work?
I'm nervous about it. I'm very nervous about it, but I guess I'm not going to be more so nervous about it than my mom and my grandmother reading my work, because I'm very open about things in my poetry. But yeah, I definitely worry about it, especially this most recent collection that I finished, 40 weeks. I wrote a poem for each week of pregnancy with my daughter. And the poems are very open about my husband's medical issues at the time of being pregnant with her, and just a lot of things that I don't know if she'll be old enough to understand. But I also think that by the time that she reads the poems, is my hope, that she will be old enough to understand it. So yeah, it's very complicated. I was just on a panel about motherhood, and Era D. Matthews said that she really tries not to write about her children, because she says these are their stories to tell. They're all artists, and I don't want to take their stories. But I kind of think that the same story, right, or the same moment can be told and written both from the mother's and the child's perspective, and I would hope that they would, be proud of me versus feel like I'm exposing things. But that's definitely a concern. It's definitely a concern.
Yeah, it's just a very basic question. When did you first start writing poems, and is the main language of your poetry always English or sometimes Russian?
It's always English, and I think it's because I started writing poetry to find my way in the English language. I was in 3rd grade, and we had a unit on poetry, and I remember struggling a lot with making friends, and just struggling as not only am I weird and a nerd, but I also am an immigrant, and so my teacher told me to channel that into writing, and that's what I did. But I think while I don't write in Russian, some of the cadences of my poems, to me at least, often sound like Russian poetry, because that's what I grew up hearing. I grew up on Pushkin and on Akhmatova and Blok and Mandelstam, and having to memorize those poems. So I feel like there's a kind of multi-linguistic element to the poetry, even though it's English on the page. It kind of leaps off the page with some Russian cadences.
It's not always English either, right? You read just plenty of Russian.
Yeah. Yeah.
I have another question. I'm wondering where that necessity to write out specifically historical drama came from for you. Because it's something that, feels so necessary, but not everyone has this. In fact, I think very few people who have that experience of multi-generational trauma have that obsessive need to keep digging it up, you know? I wonder if you, you know, feel like
Absolutely. So I think I need to start doing this when I read the poem Learning Yiddish, but I always feel it's almost like because I'm writing poetry, certain things are less exposed than they would be if I were to write them as a lyric essay. So my great-grandmother, who is just kind of the looming inspiration figure for me, raised me in many ways. I grew up with her, living with her. And late in life, she started seeing a Nazi and that he had come back to life. That's what Learning Yiddish, the poem, is about. And she was, you know, she believed this was happening. Until that point, I don't think I had ever heard about what really, like what happened to my great-grandfather. I remember it just, you know, it's not something that was often talked about. And so seeing her struggle and almost have these reenactments of that trauma made it very present for me. Made it not something that's intergenerational and in the past, but something that she is currently dealing with. And something that I, as a 16-year-old kid who was a writer, didn't know how to deal with at the time, but something that really made a big impression on me. So maybe my obsessive need to keep writing it is a way of trying to help her get over something she never could have gotten over, because she was trapped in the cycle of seeing, you know.
So writing about poetry about the Holocaust growing up in the United States, it's a fascinating thing, fascinating like topic, and I loved what you had to say about like writing about the past to keep the present in mind. But then my question is, given what's going on in Ukraine right now, how, I mean, are you tempted to switch your focus to the present with what's happened again, about what this means as, I mean, the perspective of what it means to be a Jewish immigrant from Ukraine in the United States. I mean, literally right now, like in the last 48 hours, I'm sitting here trying to get people to write things for the Monkey Cage about this from exactly these kind of perspectives at the moment. But like, with everything that's happened in Ukraine in the last 3 years, are you tempted to sort of shift your focus to what this means to you today in this context? Or do you consider yourself sort of like firmly rooted in, no, this is what I want to do, I want to talk about this historical period, this particular experience, because I think, as you said before, it's so important that this doesn't get forgotten, but there's so much to be distracting about kind of what's going on right now. So I wonder how you think about that as a poet and as a scholar.
I think as a scholar, my project is pretty committed to that time period, because as a scholar, you just have to limit. As a poet, not at all. I mean, when everything was happening with Maidan, I wrote a lot.
Oh, you did? Okay.
Yeah. And in fact, when things were happening with Maidan, it was the first time I wrote kind of more of a lyric essay. It was my first real published lyric essay, and because I felt I had to break out of the poetry form in order to say what I wanted to say about being someone that's from Ukraine, but not Ukrainian, watching a trauma that's not my trauma, but brings me back to things that I misremember or unremember. So there's, you know, it's also a very complicated relationship being a Jewish refugee from Ukraine, and being, I identify with Ukraine, but I almost identify more as someone from the post-Soviet time.
Well, and especially with the kind of post-Maidan narrative and the bringing up of the Banderites as a sort of explanation for what happened and all these sorts of, I mean, I imagine it must be sort of very complex if where you are meshed in as a scholar is in the Holocaust, which has a very, very, of course, very complicated relationship with Ukraine, and then to see the sort of Russian propaganda about is what happened in Ukraine, evoking the same imagery that you're trying to evoke in your work, that must just be, you know, complex. So that's great to hear that you're writing about it.
Yeah, you know, Lacan enters in. All of a sudden you get this very Lacanian moment.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, if we have no more questions, thank you so much, Julia, for inaugurating the season of Jordan Center's lecture series. Thank you, everybody, for coming here. Julia's books are on the table. This is the book from which she read, and the many names for mother. Thank you.